Have you ever hit an API and all you got back in response was internal server error with no clue what's going on? That's not just frustrating, that's sign of poor exception handling. In this video, I'll show you how to handle exceptions in Spring Boot like a pro. We'll use controller advice and exception handling annotations to create clean and structured error response to help your clients and your team to understand exactly what's going on. Whether you're building your first API or maintaining one in production, that's the kind of thing that sets professionals apart. Let's dive in. So here we have a really simple API using Spring Boot as usual. We have just a controller which listens on /users and expects to receive the ID of the user to get that one and just throw a runtime exception. Let's take a look what happens here. I will call that /user/1. And then we have an internal server error. The error is internal server error. The HTTP status 500 as internal server error. And yeah, that's not that useful, right? We didn't find that specific user on the database, but the API returned 500 instead of 404. How we can solve that? First things first, this is the default exception handling for Spring Boot applications. So whether you don't have any treatment on that, Spring will return that way always. So that's the main problem. Like every exception, if not mapped to according HTTP status code, it will return as 500 for every exception. Even though like IO exception, obviously, but in our case, like we didn't find a user, it will return 500 because the Spring will not be able to identify which one exactly needs to be responded, right? So the first thing we need to do is stop throwing generic exceptions and throw our own exception. So let me create here a package called exception. And here we're going to create like resource not found exception. You could create like user not found exception. I prefer to create something more abstract like resource not found, because then you can use for multiple domains on your application instead of a single one. But it's up to you. This extends runtime exception just to not be a checked exception. If you don't know what is a checked exceptions are that ones that you need to either give a try catch block or add to the signature of the method, like throws IO exception, for example. So every exception that extends exception, not runtime exception, but exception, they are checked, and you need to do that. When you extend non-checked exception like runtime exception, you can just throw and no code change is needed. Okay, so just create a constructor here. Let's receive just a message and then call the super message. And yeah, we already have our exception, so let's switch for our own. Okay, let's try. Let's see what happens. The same behavior here. Even though we are using our own exception, Spring doesn't know which status to respond, and it's respond as internal server error, and that's it. In the console, you can see the exception. Here we have the message, but that's not useful for the client who is consuming our API, right? So to solve that, we have basically three options. I don't like the first two, but I will present to you guys anyways, just to know that it exists. I really like the last one, which is a centralized way to do that. But let's take a look on the first two. So the first one is by adding like an annotation called response status. And then we have what we have here. We have value or code, like we can use Ooh, value would be great. Code. We can use HTTP status like not found, and we can set a reason for that, like resource not found. Okay, let's take a look on this. Let's try now. Much better, right? So we have the 404 not found here, we have the status here, but we don't have our message. We have a generic error. It says not found and not resource not found. So this is not that helpful. Let's try another way to do that. Instead of throwing our own exception, we can throw another one called throw new response status exception, which have 3 constructors that we can, that we can pass just the status codes and a message, and we have the trouble as well if you want to. Okay, so let's try like HTTP status not found and a message like user not found. Let's take a look what happens here. So pretty much the same behavior here, still with not our message, and that's it. So again, this was 2 options that I do not recommend you guys to do. I was just presenting to you guys to know that it exists. So now let's go with the better approach. Let me remove these. We are still going to throw our own exception, right? This is our exception, not a generic one. Let me remove these from here, and let's add something called controller advice, but I will just name in another way because the annotation is controller advice. It will require the annotation to be fully qualified and name it. So let me just like global exception handler. So let's add the annotation controller advice to that. By annotating your exception handler with this annotation controller advice, what happens is that you are telling Spring like, oh, this is the main point to treat exceptions, to handle exceptions and respond in the right way to our consumers. Okay? So, but by doing just this, it won't solve anything. We need also to, how is the controller advice class mostly? You need to create separated methods for each type of exception you want to handle it differently. So for example, for our resource not found exception, we want to return 404 not found, and also with that we are going to return the message that we want to send back to the consumer. Another example is for, let's think you have a validation exception and you received an invalid payload on a post request. And during the service layer or whatever, you throw this validation exception because one attribute is invalid, for example. So you can map this validation exception here on the controller advice on another method and maps this validation exception to the status code 400 bad request and then respond properly. Okay, and you can have as well like a catch, kind of catch. All these methods you can think like a catch on the try catch block. Okay, so you have a catch for, in our case, resource not found exception, and you have a catch. We would have a catch for valid exception, valid payload exception, whatever. And you can have as well as in a try catch block, you can have a default one like catch exception in general, the exception class, and then make it return 500, for example. Okay, so let's take a look. We can annotate our method with exception handler, and here we are going to pass the type of it, which is resource not found exception, And then we can create the method. In fact, let me response entity of something that we are going to create in a second, like handle resource not found exception. The method name is irrelevant. You can name as whatever you want. And here we can receive the exception itself. And here we can return like something like response entity of that of not good. Let me just do this status or not found. We are going to respond with status not found, and then set a body like the message that we received on the exception. And then we can build that. I think we don't need to build. So let's take a look now what's happening. Just a recap here. So we annotated our global exception handler with controller advice, which tells Spring, oh, this is the center point of exception handling in our application in terms of APIs. And we have a catch. You can think this method as a catch on a try catch block that catches resource not found exception. And then we are properly return a response entity with not found and the message we are sending on the exception. For that, let me just add an AAA here for us to see that in fact working. Let's see. Let me clean this up. And yeah, we have the response here, but can you see we responded here as a string, not a JSON. That's why we received that. You can see the status code is correct, but this is very bad. So here, to make this response better than a just raw string and return a JSON properly, we can define a DTO of API error. So in this case, we can have like a status code there. We can have a list of errors and then return that errors as list or just a single error. Even though you can return the trouble as well, I do not recommend that because you might expose some sensitive data and expose your stack to the consumer. I do not recommend that for real. So let's create that. As you can see here, we are creating packages on our application and we already have 3 packages, and this is just a simple example. On the real world, we are going to have multiples packages and multiple layers of packages. So in order to make your application professional and well structured, I have a free ebook you can download on the description right down below for free to help you to structure your Spring Boot application like a professional. Okay, so let's create something called like error response DTO. Actually, it's not a class, it's a record. And then we can have an instant timestamp. We can have an integer status. We can have a list, as I said, list of string errors. So actually, to make things easier, I will just leave as a string like error. But you could, as I said, you could return a list of errors. It's totally up to you how you want to design your response. So here we can change that to error response, error. What? Response detail is here. Oh, it's error. It's wrong. Rename. Error. Okay, now it's good. And then we can change that to be like new error response detail, which expects timestamp now, and also HTTP status not found dot value, and also e.get message. And let's see how is that returned. Way better. right? Way better. So now we have the 404 as returned status. We have the timestamp. We have the status here as well. We have the message, finally what we meant to, right? So we have exactly the message that we sent here, and we have it in a regular JSON and a meaningful JSON, right, for the consumer to check that. So let's now make another catch, another exception handler, but for exceptions in general, because let's think, like instead of return this one, we're going to return true and runtime exception. Let's see what happens. Everything's still the same because you are delegating to Spring to handle an exception that you are not handling here. Okay, so to solve that, we can add another one as a fallback. Instead of resource not found exception, I could use runtime exception, but in this case, exceptions like IO exception, it doesn't extend from runtime exception. So the idea here is to get the more abstract exception we have as exception itself. Okay, so in this case, we are going to handle generic exceptions. Again, the name of the method it doesn't matter at all. You can use whatever you want. And here, in fact, we're going to respond internal server error because we don't know what happened. We just throw an exception, and we are not mapped, and we haven't mapped it for any other status. So let's use the default one, and that's pretty much the idea. Let's see what happens now. So now we can see like internal server error 500 here. The message is user not found because it's the message right here, right? So even though we throw an IO exception, like couldn't connect to the DB, it is asking me to add to the method signature, as I said about the checked exceptions. So yeah, that's it. So basically the idea here is for you to add as much as catch exceptions types you want to map everything into a common error response, and then your API will be pretty much well designed and your clients will be happy to read a message which is meaningful. Okay, so that's all for today's video. I hope you like it as much as I did. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon. See you on the next one.